Exposing the Soviet Union's war crimes in Afghanistan. Warning: this content contains disturbing details. Viewer discretion is advised. Introduction. The Soviet-Afghan War, 1979 to 1989, was one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. It was not only a battle of ideologies, communism versus Islamic resistance, but also a grim example of state-sponsored violence and war crimes. The Soviet Union, under the guise of aiding a fragile communist regime, unleashed a campaign of terror on Afghanistan that left millions dead, displaced, or traumatized. This article seeks to uncover the hidden truths behind these atrocities, focusing on the human cost of the conflict. 1. The Soviet invasion, background and motives. To understand the Soviet war crimes, one must first examine the motives behind their invasion. The Soviet Union sought to bolster the communist government in Afghanistan, fearing the rise of Islamic resistance and Western influence in the region. However, their intervention was met with fierce resistance from the Mujahideen, a coalition of Afghan fighters determined to protect their homeland. The Soviets underestimated the cultural and tribal complexities of Afghanistan, leading to a protracted and brutal conflict. Their military strategy soon shifted from countering the Mujahideen to targeting the civilian population, who they believed were providing support to the resistance. Crimes against civilians. A campaign of terror, 2.1 mass bombings and scorched earth tactics. Entire villages were bombed indiscriminately, reducing homes, schools, and mosques to rubble. The Soviet forces implemented a scorched earth policy, destroying crops, water sources, and infrastructure to starve the resistance and force civilians into submission. Eyewitnesses described the skies darkening with Soviet aircraft, dropping bombs that annihilated everything in their path. Families were buried under the debris of their own homes, and survivors often had nowhere to turn for safety. 2.2. Use of chemical weapons. The Soviet military employed chemical weapons, including poisonous gases, in their operations. These weapons were not only used against armed combatants, but also against civilians. Villagers reported seeing clouds of gas that left people choking, vomiting, and eventually dying in agony. Children, the elderly, and pregnant women were among the most vulnerable victims. 2.3 landmines disguised as toys. Perhaps one of the most sinister tactics employed by the Soviets was the use of landmines disguised as toys. These mines were deliberately designed to attract children, who would pick them up out of curiosity. The result was devastating. Thousands of children lost their limbs or lives. To this day, unexploded landmines continue to kill and maim innocent Afghans, serving as a grim reminder of the war. 3. Systematic violence, torture, rape, and forced disappearances. 3.1. Torture and detention camps. The Soviet forces set up detention camps where suspected Mujahideen supporters were imprisoned, tortured, and often executed without trial. Methods of torture include electrocution, beatings, and psychological torment. Survivors have recounted harrowing tales of being forced to watch loved ones being brutalized. 3.2. Sexual violence as a weapon of war. Sexual violence was another horrifying aspect of the Soviet campaign. Afghan women were subjected to rape and sexual slavery by Soviet soldiers. These acts were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader strategy to humiliate and break the spirit of resistance. Victims were often ostracized by their communities, adding another layer of suffering. 3.3. Forced disappearances and mass graves. Many Afghans who were detained by Soviet forces simply vanished. Decades later, mass graves have been discovered containing the remains of men, women, and children who were executed. Families continue to search for answers about the fate of their loved ones, highlighting the enduring impact of these crimes. 4. The long-term impact on Afghanistan. 4.1. A nation in ruins. By the end of the Soviet occupation, Afghanistan was left in ruins. The infrastructure was destroyed, the economy was shattered, and millions of Afghans were displaced, both internally and as refugees. The social fabric of the country was torn apart, with communities divided and trust eroded. 4.2. Psychological trauma, generations of suffering. The psychological impact of the Soviet-Afghan war runs deep, leaving behind a population scarred by decades of violence and loss. Survivors of the war recount experiences so harrowing that they continue to haunt them years later. Entire generations of Afghans have grown up in an environment defined by fear, displacement, and destruction. For many, the war's trauma manifests as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Witnessing loved ones killed, homes destroyed, and entire communities uprooted has left a profound psychological toll. Parents who lived through the war often pass down their fear and grief to their children, creating a cycle of intergenerational trauma. Moreover, the inability to grieve or find closure has deepened the wounds. The lack of accountability and justice for these crimes leaves survivors feeling powerless and forgotten. While some attempt to move on, the constant reminders of war, such as unexploded landmines, destroyed infrastructure, and ongoing violence, make healing nearly impossible. Afghanistan's mental health system remains ill-equipped to address these widespread issues. With limited resources and stigma surrounding mental health care, many continue to suffer in silence. The psychological impact of the Soviet war is not confined to individuals but extends to Afghan society as a whole, affecting its ability to rebuild and move forward. 4.3. A legacy of violence, decades of instability. The Soviet-Afghan War did not end with the withdrawal of Soviet troops in 1989. Instead, it set the stage for decades of instability, violence, and suffering. The war created a power vacuum that led to civil conflict among various factions of the Mujahideen, eventually paving the way for the rise of the Taliban in the 1990s. The proliferation of arms during the war fueled this instability. The Soviets supplied weapons to their allies, while the Mujahideen received support from the United States, Pakistan, and other nations. When the war ended, Afghanistan was left awash with weapons, which were often used in subsequent conflicts. The legacy of landmines is another haunting reminder of the Soviet occupation. Afghanistan remains one of the most heavily mined countries in the world, with these devices killing or maiming thousands of civilians each year. Farmers, children, and travelers are often the victims of these hidden explosives, which continue to hinder Afghanistan's economic recovery and development. The Soviet war also contributed to the erosion of trust within Afghan society. Communities were divided, with some accused of collaborating with the Soviets and others joining the resistance. This division, coupled with decades of violence, has left Afghanistan struggling to rebuild a sense of national unity and identity. 5. Seeking justice. Why accountability matters. #5.1 International Law and War Crimes. The actions of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan constitute clear violations of international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions, which protect civilians during times of war, were repeatedly disregarded. Deliberate attacks on civilians, the use of chemical weapons, torture, and sexual violence are all classified as war crimes. Despite the overwhelming evidence, there has been little progress in holding the perpetrators accountable. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 further complicated efforts to seek justice, as many of those responsible for the atrocities were either dead or had transitioned into new political roles within the successor states. This lack of accountability sends a dangerous message: that powerful nations can commit war crimes without consequence. It undermines the very foundation of international law and justice, leaving victims without recourse or recognition. The role of the international community. The international community has largely failed Afghanistan when it comes to addressing Soviet war crimes. While there have been efforts to document the atrocities, such as reports by human rights organizations and survivor testimonies, there has been little movement toward formal investigations or trials. Geopolitical interests often overshadow the pursuit of justice. During the Cold War, the focus was on defeating the Soviet Union, not holding it accountable. Even after the war ended, global attention shifted to other conflicts and crises, leaving Afghanistan's pain unaddressed. The lack of reparations or support for victims further compounds the injustice. Survivors and their families continue to suffer without recognition or assistance, while the international community turns a blind eye to their plight. 5.3 A call for justice. For the survivors of the Soviet-Afghan War, justice is more than a pursuit of punishment. It is a plea for recognition and acknowledgement of their suffering. Justice means shining a light on the crimes committed, ensuring that the victim's pain is neither ignored nor erased from history. Acknowledgement is not merely symbolic. It validates the experiences of those who endured unimaginable horrors and reinforces the principle that such atrocities cannot and must not be tolerated. Justice can manifest in multiple forms. War crimes tribunals offer a formal avenue for prosecuting perpetrators, but they are only one aspect of justice. Reparations in the form of financial aid or rehabilitation programs for survivors and their families provide tangible support for those affected. Memorialization efforts, such as building monuments, recording oral histories, or establishing museums, can preserve the memory of these atrocities for future generations, ensuring they are never forgotten. While prosecuting those responsible for Soviet war crimes may be complex due to time, geopolitical constraints, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, documenting the truth remains critical. Survivor testimonies, historical records, and investigations by international human rights organizations form the foundation of this documentation. Afghan civil society, alongside global institutions, must collaborate to ensure that these stories are preserved and shared widely. Justice is not only about looking backward, but also about building a foundation for a more just and humane future. It sends a resounding message to the world that the lives of civilians caught in the crossfire of war are invaluable, and that the international community has a duty to protect them regardless of political circumstances. Personal accounts, stories of survival. The voices of survivors offer a stark, unfiltered lens into the horrors of the Soviet occupation. Each story is a testament to the resilience, strength, and courage of individuals who endured unspeakable suffering while holding on to hope and dignity. Story 1. A mother's loss. Fatima, a mother of 5, vividly recalls the day her entire world was destroyed. Her small village became a target for Soviet bombers, turning their peaceful existence into a nightmare. The sound of the aircraft is something I can never forget, she recounts. I ran to save my children, but it was too late. As the bombs fell, her home was reduced to rubble, burying her children alive. I pulled my babies from the debris with my own hands, she says, her voice trembling. I buried them myself. Since that day, I have been burying my grief too. Nash Story 2, a child's innocence destroyed. Ahmed was only 8 years old when his life changed forever. While playing in a field near his home, he stumbled upon a brightly colored object that resembled a toy. Unaware of the danger, he reached out to grab it, and in an instant, the object exploded. The blast took his right arm and left his face scarred with shrapnel wounds. I remember the pain and the confusion, Ahmed recalls, his voice heavy with emotion. I didn't understand what had happened. I just wanted to play like any other child. The explosion robbed Ahmed of his innocence and his dreams. The physical scars are a constant reminder of that day, but the emotional pain runs even deeper. I lost more than my arm that day. I lost my chance at a normal childhood, my ability to trust, and a part of myself that I'll never get back, he says. Now in his 40s, Ahmed still struggles with the aftermath of the war. I've learned to live with my disability, but the memories are harder to overcome, he shares. Despite his challenges, Ahmed remains resilient, using his story to advocate for the removal of landmines and the protection of innocent lives. Story 3, a father's fight for justice. Hassan's life was shattered when Soviet soldiers raided his village one fateful night. Accusing his wife and 2 young sons of harboring Mujahideen fighters, they dragged them away, leaving Hassan helpless and desperate. For years I searched for them, Hassan recounts, his voice trembling with grief. I went from one village to another, asking anyone who would listen if they had seen my family. His quest for answers led him to heart-wrenching discoveries, including mass graves near his village where dozens of bodies lay buried. I don't know if my wife and sons are among those buried there, Hassan says, his eyes filled with tears. But I pray for their souls every day. I hold on to the hope that their suffering wasn't in vain, and that one day the world will know what happened to us. For Hassan, justice means more than punishment. It's about acknowledgement, he says. The world needs to recognize what we endured and ensure that no one else has to suffer the same fate. Conclusion. remembering the victims, demanding justice. The Soviet Union's war crimes in Afghanistan remain one of history's darkest chapters. The stories of victims like Ahmed and Hassan serve as harrowing reminders of the human cost of war. These atrocities demand acknowledgement, not just as a tribute to those who suffered, but as a commitment to preventing similar crimes in the future. The suffering endured by Afghan civilians highlights the importance of upholding international law and ensuring accountability for war crimes. Ignoring these atrocities undermines the principles of justice and human rights, leaving victims without closure and perpetrators unpunished. Despite the deep scars left by the war, the Afghan people continue to show resilience and strength. By documenting these crimes, supporting survivors, and pursuing justice, the global community can help Afghanistan heal and rebuild. The legacy of the Soviet-Afghan War is one of immense pain, but it also carries the potential for hope and perseverance if the world chooses to act with compassion and resolve. Let us never forget the voices of the victims. Their pain, resilience, and courage deserve to be heard, honored, and remembered for generations to come.